As the war in Ukraine brings ever more death and destruction, key European officials fear Moscow is now preparing for conflict with the West. My guest this week goes along with that view. He's Kaupo Rosin, head of Estonia's intelligence service, but he still believes Russia can lose.
Our task in the West should be to make sure that Russia comes out of this conflict as a weakened power.
So how united is the West, and how vital is it that Ukraine gets the weapons it wants? Kaupo Rosin, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Pleasure.
In your view, how long does the West have before it might, I say might, have to fight a war with Russia?
Of course, I have to say that we do not really track the developments in the West. The answer to that question is it should be as long as Russia is defeated. And I think this is a mission which is absolutely possible to conduct.
You say that, but in your intelligence report in February, you said that a military confrontation with the West, Russia was preparing for that, and that could happen within 10 years. There are other people, other officials in Europe who are shortening that timeline. In July, the Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, General Rowley Walker, warned that NATO had 3 to 5 years to prepare for war with what he called an axis of upheaval. That's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Do you agree with that?
Okay, so for me to understand the question better, the point is that the timeline or the space what we have on our disposal before a potential conflict with Russia, there are several factors in that timeline. Of course, first we have to make sure that this potential event doesn't happen at all. So the first big question is how does the conflict in Ukraine ends? And that will determine the future path of Russia, who is the aggressor in this issue. If we have a situation after the, let's say, Ukraine-Russia war, where Russia emerges from that as a victorious, very self-confident power, it will make all calculations based on that new situation then. Our task in the West should be to make sure that Russia comes out of this conflict as a weakened power, which or who might be then resolving some of the internal problems which it would probably run into if there is a Russian defeat in that conflict. And I think Putin would not survive a Russian defeat. And the second question is how long it takes Russians to reconstitute or generate forces. We have to keep in mind that, and I wouldn't like to talk about the Russian reconstitution. I would like to name that issue maybe a Russian force generation or Russian forces development. We have to keep in mind that the Russian armed forces today are several 100,000 men bigger than it was before before launching the large-scale invasion, and that this is the capabilities part. And Russia keeps generating forces. It generates additional manpower, running into bigger and bigger problems with the generating, but currently they are on track with that. And of course, ammunition production and equipment production or refurbishment and production with the Russians are also in a good track. So we have.
I want to come on and deal with some of those issues in detail. But this month's newspaper reports, you talk about Russia needs to be weaker if the West is to avoid a war, emerge weaker from its war with Ukraine. This month's newspaper reports say Russia had already received more than 200 ballistic missiles from Iran at a port on the Caspian Sea, and there was a risk that more would be provided. If those missiles keep coming from Iran and from other members of that so-called axis of upheaval, Russia isn't going to emerge weaker. It's going to emerge much stronger, isn't it, if this trend continues?
The Russians are currently trying to boost up its military strength. And of course, based on that military strength, they are conducting attritional warfare with Ukraine. So our task is to make sure that the attrition ratio is in a beneficial, but the number is beneficial for Ukraine. It is also, I would assess that Russia cannot keep this attrition rate up for coming years and years. So we have to make sure that Ukrainians have the power to treat the Russians as much as possible. And the question is, how do we, let's say, deal with the Russian intention part vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis the West? Again, the main task what they have to solve before it comes to any potential conflict between NATO and Russia is to make sure that Ukraine emerges as a big, let's say, as winning part of this this conflict, because that
yes, but it doesn't look like that at the moment, does it? It doesn't look as though it's winning. It's suffering steady losses on the Eastern Front, never mind the fact that it's advanced its own forces into the Kursk region inside Russia. But it's not doing well on the Eastern Front at all, is it?
It is. I think the situation is very difficult, but I wouldn't say that the Russians are, let's say, doing great either. What the Russians probably would like to do is to treat the Ukrainian part as much as possibly so the Ukrainian front would collapse. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So, and I'm not sure either if the Russians have a clear victory strategy also. I'm not sure they have that very, very clearly defined. They have it in the public rhetorics. We know what they want, let's say, based on what they say. But in the reality, it's something they cannot achieve, I would say.
Do you think Mr. Putin wants a war with the West?
I think he respects NATO, but it is also, again, we have to make sure that this respect continues over the coming years. And again, it comes to our part then, how well are we prepared? How good are our plans for the eastern flank?
So you're saying he'd like to have a war if he can get away with it? Is that your conclusion?
He has the feeling that he gets away and nothing happens to him, he comes out clean, then it might run into the calculations. But I would say, if I come back to Ukraine-Russia situation, then let's say even if it comes to the situation where there will be negotiations between Russia and maybe Ukrainians, but I would assess that the Russians would likely only would like to talk to the Americans only over the heads of Europeans, and they would also like to discuss not only Ukraine, but also the broader security, European security architecture. So what their goal would be is to push NATO capabilities and activities as far as possible from the Russian border, and create a new situation on the ground based on that. And then again, calculate forward from that moment. And this type of discussion obviously is very dangerous if it comes to the agenda.
Okay,
which we hope it won't.
You talked about the need for NATO to up its game. How much faith do you have in the alliance at the moment? I ask because 2 years ago your former Prime Minister Kaja Kallas was highly critical of NATO's plans to defend the Baltic states. She said they would have resulted in Estonia being wiped off the map. Has NATO upped its game where its planning is concerned? How did it come up with a plan like that in the first place?
Well, I don't know how it came up with a plan like this, but I have the feeling that
it was pretty hopeless, wasn't it?
Well, it was definitely not beneficial for us. But I would say, as far as I know, the plans have changed in that regard. And well, it's a constant work. Of course, it needs a lot of discussion in NATO between NATO allies, or different allies have different viewpoints, which is understandable. It's a beauty of the alliance, but I think we are on the right track. Most of countries understand the threat what Russia poses, also mid and long term. And there is a general understanding that we have to be prepared, or we have to be prepared to protect ourselves or to defend ourselves.
What about the troops that Kaja Kallas wanted, the NATO troops, between 20 and 25,000 to be based in Estonia? Has that happened? Will it happen?
No, well, that's probably a question more for Chief of Defense, how many troops are needed here. And
well, she went public saying that it hadn't happened and she needed it to happen. And the last reports we've had saying that it hasn't happened. So that's why I'm putting the question to you.
Absolutely. So I think the question here is about what units are designated for, let's say, reinforcement. Again, the concrete numbers are more in the defense forces domain. Probably the question is how many troops we have forward deployed in the peacetime, which must be also manageable, both in training areas and economically. And what is probably important for us is that we have all over NATO troops designated for potential follow-on reinforcements, which then would be launched after a proper early warning is given.
So what's the answer? Do you have enough troops or not at the moment to repel a Russian advance, should there be one?
I think we would give up. We would give a good fight to the Russians, and then hopefully reinforcements would arrive rapidly according to the plans.
And do you have a cast-iron guarantee that more than 30 countries, the members of NATO, will fight side by side with you if you're attacked?
I'm pretty confident in that, but again...
it's not in the small print, is it? It's not in Article 5.
Yeah, but the question is about the NATO defense plans, which are constantly developed, and it's an ongoing work. That's how it is.
We've been talking about a possible war with Russia, but in a sense, it's already begun, hasn't it? If you can talk to me a little bit about the sabotage operations that have the Kremlin's fingerprints on them, not just in Estonia, but elsewhere in Europe. Is this a growing trend?
Well, it is a tool what Russia thinks it can use against the West in order to disrupt us, to bring tension into our societies. Russia probably hopes that it will remain under Article 5 with these activities. In the Estonian case, we have more than 15 people arrested over the last year in the connection with Russian sabotage activities. It seems that this sabotage activity is conducted throughout Europe in the form of arson, etc. It is something...
How serious are they, these attacks?
I would say if I look in the Estonian case, then the level varies a lot. We have incidents of vandalism, which are, let's say, more or less harmless, up to arson. The question is, of course, let's say how it develops. It has escalated horizontal and vertical over the last year. So if this...
But with the aim of what? With the aim of destabilizing your country, or just keeping you on your toes, or making people nervous? What?
It's mainly to create tension. It also tries to probably undermine the support to Ukraine. It is there to disrupt us. It is here to tie our resources, so we would pay more attention towards internal issues and trying to divert our attention from the support to the Ukrainians.
Let's talk about Ukraine's urgent request to use long-range Western missiles on targets in Russia. Your president, Ala Karis, poured scorn on the NATO countries that have withheld use of their long-range missiles for Ukraine because of fears of escalating the crisis. Was he right to do that? He said it was pure self-deception and reflected indecision and fear which played into Russian hands. If your president is right and NATO is becoming indecisive and fearful, then NATO is no longer fit for purpose, is it?
Well, I have to agree with my president. In this current conflict, there are some if you look into history, there are several let's say, new paradigms what Russia has sometimes successfully installed in the head of Westerners. So the first paradigm what the Russians are trying to communicate is that the conflict should happen only on the territory of the victim, and the aggressor, for whatever reason, should remain untouched. This is first time in the military history. And the second idea what the Russians are trying to, let's say, communicate overtly, covertly to us is that it is impossible for Russia to lose. Again, it's not correct. Russia has lost several wars throughout the history. So
no, but the other members of NATO are not persuaded of that, are they? Other members are showing, in his words, indecision and fear, aren't they?
Russians are trying to install this fear. So it is, of course, task for us, for the Eastern flank countries, to keep explaining this to our Western allies. And I think the understanding is also a little bit changing already, also in more Western countries. But I agree, it has, let's say, taken too long time for this change.
Well, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? Because your president said, I hear several countries expressing a desire for a quick diplomatic solution and compromise with Russia. And there's a spreading hope that resetting relations with Putin's Russia is possible or even inevitable. You don't believe that, do you?
Well, I am convinced that the Russian current regime must be defeated strategically. Because even if Putin is partially successful in his objectives, we assess that he would continue in principle. So the war in Ukraine would be not over in mid-term, even if we have a frozen conflict at some point or something they like. So, and we have to also understand that the Russians are, according to themselves, they are in the war already with the collective West in their own understanding. So I don't see there are many options for us if we talk about the longer term conflict resolution than to make sure that Ukrainians win at the end. And again, I think it is doable, actually.
If the Ukrainians don't get the weapons they need or permission to use the ones they have inside Russia, will it be impossible for them to win?
I think that one weapon system like ATACMS, for example, it's...
that's long-range missiles.
Yes.
American long-range missiles.
It has become very symbolic at this point. Let's say this weapon system alone doesn't solve the conflict at all. But the question is, it's about political support or understanding from Russian side that they are able to deter us based on their rhetoric. Luckily, the Ukrainians have been developing their own weapons, which seems to be sometimes more efficient when I look at what happens in Russia.
But we've had a Ukrainian politician on this program just a week ago saying the West has given us enough weapons to fight, but not enough to win. That's the view coming out of Ukraine at the moment. Don't you see where they're coming from?
It is hard to argue with this. It is an attrition warfare. So at the end, the side with more will and more resource will win. It's a question about proper attrition rate for both sides. Ukraine needs additional weapons, additional ammunition to make that happen, obviously. So again, we shouldn't restrain ourselves in supporting Ukraine with any type of weapons or ammunition they need. And I agree that it has taken too long time for some of the decisions to be made. But again, I don't see that the cause is lost totally at this point.
But there are divisions emerging in Europe among NATO. We have the Czech President Pavel, saying Ukraine needed to be realistic. The most probable outcome of the war would be that Russia would hold on to some of the territories it's captured, at least temporary. That's pretty defeatist, isn't it? If that idea takes root in NATO, that's not going to be good for Ukraine, is it?
Well, our talking point is that Ukraine can still win this. So there are discussions to be held, seems to be.
In contrast to NATO countries, Russia has been busy transforming its economy into a war economy. It's churning out ammunition and advanced weaponry, some of which is not so far appearing on the battlefield. Does that not suggest to you that Russia is preparing for a much bigger conflict?
Currently what we see is that all the resources of Russian armed forces and Russian Federation in principle are going towards Ukraine. So if we look at the situation currently along our borders, there is not much Russian military power available from the Russian side. So that's the good news. So question is, if it takes for Russians so long and it's so painful to trying to defeat the Ukrainians, then question is how would Russia perform against the West, which is much more advanced? I'm not sure that would go on. The potential conflict would go out in Russian favor. Of course, we have to make sure that in our side the proper resources, clans, equipment available, ammunition stocks are at the, let's say, needed level, I would say. Question is, of course, if the war stops in Russia, the active phase of the conflict stops in whatever line, it will be very painful for Russian economy to come out of this war economy mode. That would be very interesting to watch. So they would keep producing, and from that point on, if we take away the attrition which they are having in Ukraine, from that point on, the, let's say, growth of Russian military is then speeding up, I would say.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy has taken what he calls his victory plan to Washington to run it past the Americans. He said it's a plan to strengthen Ukraine and force Russia to the negotiating table. Is Ukraine able to do that, in your view, force Russia to the negotiating table?
I haven't seen the victory plan. Again, currently, I do not see any will from Russian side to negotiate anything. Since again, let's say the perceived weakness of West invites further escalation from the Russian side.
It's not just perceived, it is weakness, isn't it? It's weakness and division in the West.
I think we are actually much stronger if we would be more willing to, let's say, play out this strength. And again, another point is that...
Well, what are you waiting for? What's the West waiting for?
Well...
I mean, there have been enough calls and enough warnings.
We are pushing our Western allies, and not only we, all the time. It's a daily work. And this is the situation. But again, I see some movement, so I'm not that pessimistic overall, but it is a work we have to continue.
One of the points in President Zelenskyy's victory plan is that he wants further security guarantees. Will they be worth the paper they're written on, even if he gets them? The Budapest Memorandum, which was supposed to secure Ukraine's future when it gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994, hasn't done so well for them, has it? Particularly since it was guaranteed both by Russia and America.
So, well, we support the Ukrainian path to NATO, which would be the proper security guarantee in our view.
Is Ukraine going to win? Not at the moment, is it? Not unless the West gets its act together and gives it the weapons, is it? It's not going to win.
No, well, we have to think what would be the situation geopolitically in Europe and in the world if Russia, let's say, wins. As I said, in that case, we would have a victorious self-confident Russia, which would make follow-on calculations based on the new situation. We would have a huge flow of refugees from Ukraine if, let's say, Russia would take over the country in one form or another. And we would have a situation where the Ukrainian resources would be turned against the West by the Russians.
Is that what keeps you awake at night?
Well, we are working day and night to, let's say, prevent that from happening.
How long?
Well, for us, this is existential issue, we understand. So we cannot be tired of doing that.
All right, Kaupo Rosin, it's good to have you on the program. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.